From the Gert Boyle studio at OPB, this is Think Out Loud. I'm Dave Miller. School board meetings have become increasingly contentious in districts around Oregon recently. Conservative school board candidates, buoyed by a backlash against COVID-19 restrictions, have won elections, but they've also been focused on other divisive issues. In Newburgh, newly elected school board members advocated for banning Black Lives Matter signs and gay pride flags in district facilities, as well as repealing anti-racist policies previously enacted by the board and the state legislature. The board at Greater Albany Public Schools recently fired its superintendent, and the Ben Lapine School Board had to take a pause in its first community listening session because it grew too heated. We're going to get an overview of all of this from OPB's education reporter Elizabeth Miller in just a few minutes, but we start with Melissa Goff. She is the now former superintendent of Greater Albany Public Schools. Her contract was terminated without cause last month. Melissa Goff, welcome to Think Out Loud.
Thank you so much for having me.
After the school board election, with a new majority in place, did you figure that your days with Greater Albany Public Schools were numbered?
I certainly thought when this new board came into their positions that we would have some very difficult conversations, and that, yes, that eventually I may be needing to find different employment. I certainly would not have expected that to happen within the first 2 weeks, though, of their tenure. Given that they really had not had the opportunity to build a relationship or have us try to come to understandings around some of our differences.
Did you have conversations with new members of the board before you were fired?
Actually, it's interesting. The board members were sworn in on July 1st, and none of the new board members had any conversations with me in between the time that they were sworn in and the time that they voted to release me for no cause.
The board has not yet made public their reasons for that termination. Do you know why you were let go?
Well, I think the title of the termination being no cause in and of itself kind of explains it. If most boards, if they are going to dismiss a superintendent for a reason, the boards go through the hard work in order to save the taxpayers' money. There would be no reason to let go a superintendent and to pay them based on a no cause clause if there were a legitimate reason for letting them go. So in this case, I don't think that the board took action based on anything that was a legitimate concern, but perhaps more beliefs and values that were out of alignment with mine.
What do you mean by that? What are the beliefs and values that you think you and the board are not aligned with?
Well, I can't speak confidently on that because, as I said, the members themselves haven't had conversations with me, but I can say what I'm able to observe. So in our school district, it has been, and across our state, and I'm very proud of this in our state, we have been really focused on making sure that we have a strong educational system for all of our kids and making sure they're well prepared for next steps. And in order to do that, they need to be able to think critically and be exposed to multiple perspectives and grow from learning from other ways of thinking. But instead, what we are seeing, both in the actions of this board and in the actions of other boards, is that people who've been marginalized in the past are being pushed again to the edges through actions. And so the actions that I've observed are this. In the first few weeks that this board, so it's now been a little over 4 weeks, this board has hired, or the superintendent have hired, 4 positions that have not been posted. There has been no process. Those are important positions. They're the interim superintendent for the school district, the interim chief of staff for the school district, the interim executive director of operations for the school district because our former executive director resigned, and an assistant principal position. All of those positions not having been posted so that publicly people around the state or the nation could apply for them, create a lack of access for people of color, create a lack of access for bilingual people. And not surprisingly, all of those positions then were filled by white men. And that's concerning because what that doesn't do is take us on the road of making sure that those people who work with our kids reflect the diversity of the community and reflect the diversity of the students themselves. So those 4 hires in the first 4 weeks make me very concerned for the direction of the district and what their priorities are as leaders.
We reached out to all 5 members of the board asking for their statements about the decision to terminate your contract. We got 2 responses. One was from Michael Thompson, who was the lone no vote. He said you're firing, quote, following a campaign funded by conservative money and managed by a conservative activist, Reagan Knope, calls into question any statement of support for educational equity by this school board. We also heard from the chair of the board, Eric Aguinaga, who abstained from the 3-1 vote, but seems to support your termination. And he pushed back against the idea that you were let go because of your work on equity and inclusion. He talked about your interim replacement, Rob Saxton, the former chief of Oregon Schools, and he wrote this: if you listened to the board members interview Mr. Saxton, you will see the importance the board placed upon finding a leader who would have a strong focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who would bring the community together. This is something that you talked about as well in an opinion piece you wrote for The Oregonian. What leads you to believe that your termination was tied to your diversity, equity, and inclusion work?
Well, I'd first like to note that Chair Aguinaga actually voted in favor of my extremely positive evaluation and also voted in favor of the renewal of my contract under the terms that I was ultimately terminated. So I am curious about his perspective and his, I'm curious about where his motivation is for his statement. But what I will say is that when we look at, again, the decisions that are being made by the school board and whose voices they are allowing into their work, it runs counter. So I believe what people do, not just what they say. And there is very measurable steps that this board has taken that make me think they are not following through on any words of commitment to equity.
You know, I should note that we did follow up with Board Chair Aguinaga today to ask him about the votes he had previously taken in support of you, seemingly in support of you, given his seeming support for your termination. And he wrote this: I voted that way, meaning I voted earlier in support of you, because of board policy BBF number 5, which is this. He says, recognize that decisions are made by a majority vote and should be supported by all board members. I just wanted to put that out there. I should also note, if you're just tuning in, I'm talking right now with Melissa Goff, now the former superintendent of the Greater Albany Public Schools. I want to take up another issue here. The Albany Democrat-Herald had been critical of you prior to your firing, and in a recent editorial, they wrote this: the new school board also isn't trying to stop educators from teaching about critical race theory. I'd like you to respond to that. This is another issue that you've written about in your editorial in The Oregonian. What's your understanding of where the board is right now in terms of teaching students about a history of racism or systemic racism today?
I think that as our board is engaging in conversations, the conversations that they are prioritizing are conversations with those who have typically historically been in power, which is white affluent people within our community. That influences their perspective about what will be taught within the classroom. I haven't seen them actually address anything within the classroom, except for the fact that they have hired 4 very influential positions, none of which have they posted publicly to encourage diversity and equity. And so that in and of itself, when you see that those 4 positions, they themselves are the people making the decisions about what happens in the classrooms, what books get into students' hands, what professional development teachers will have. Again, their actions belie their statement.
You've pointed out, as have many educators, that critical race theory per se is not taught in K-12 classrooms in Oregon or in America. The phrase has been taken up as a kind of catch-all boogeyman recently by conservative advocates or activists who often don't want kids to be taught about various kinds of racism. But you have also said that the lens provided by critical race theory is helpful for school administrators who are focused on equity. What's an example of that?
Absolutely. So when we are looking historically at racism and how it has impacted any of the systems in the United States, so across any of our school systems, our city, our states, we can analyze and take a look at what laws were in place at the time that favored the white male. So our school systems, for example, were built for white men by white men. That's how they were structured. So as we see time progress over time, we start looking at details within our schools and see, well, have they been updated as we have seen the end of segregation? Have we actually looked at our libraries, the books that we put into our students' hands, and are those still segregated? We actually had our librarian, Jean Gritter, who's fantastic, our lead librarian for the district, went through books during COVID while students were gone, had the library team go through all of the books in all of our libraries and vet them for either overtly racist materials, or to look where representation just wasn't existent. So where there weren't authors who wrote in Spanish, or native Spanish speakers, or Black authors, or Asian authors, or protagonists that may have a learning disability or physically able differently. And so all of that work was done during COVID. And of course, it should have been done a long time ago. But by applying critical race theory as a lens and looking at, okay, so are there still things within the system? Is our system still built to marginalize people who are different? And then addressing those pieces within the system that we're able to address. That's how you apply critical race theory. It isn't taught per se within the classrooms. What's taught in the classrooms is history, English, science, mathematics, and making sure that our students see themselves represented in all of that work and hear the voices of others who have different backgrounds than themselves.
Melissa Goff, thanks very much for joining us.
I appreciate your time. And I just want to say, please vote. Voices matter. And if you happen to live in Sherwood or Newburgh or Greater Albany, please lean in and get to know your school board.
Melissa Goff is now the former superintendent of the Greater Albany Public Schools. We are talking right now about what's been happening recently with Oregon's K-12 school boards. For a broader look at the situation, I'm joined now by Elizabeth Miller. She is an education reporter for OPB. Hey, Liz.
Hey, Dave.
So I want to run a little bit more of the statement we got from Board Chair Eric Aganaga by you and by our listeners. He wrote this: "The former superintendent's problems predated the new board and are well documented by our local newspaper, the Democrat Herald. 3 new board members ran for election because of the divisiveness that was created by the district administration. The new board members did not create the problems of divisiveness. These predated the election. We ran to try to solve the problems." Can you give us a sense for the broader context here?
Yeah. So as reported by the Democrat Herald, which you said earlier has been critical of Goff, there were a few things that they wrote about that happened under Goff's leadership that did cause some frustration. Well, first, something that caused frustration and conversations everywhere, reopening and how that worked at the school district. But there were also some things specific to Albany, a proposed change to put the district's high schools on a similar schedule and help increase opportunities for students at both high schools. There was also some pushback to Goff and the district's decision to not have police officers greet students on the first day back of school in the spring, following some complaints and concerns from families who didn't feel comfortable with the police presence. That's some of the context that I've been made aware of, but I'm sure there are other things that the chair is referring to.
So some of those are Albany-specific issues, but I'm curious how you think Goff's termination in Albany fits into the larger context of what's happening right now statewide and in other Oregon public schools.
Well, I'd say there's just a lot more interest in general in what school boards and what school leaders do these days. And what happened in Albany is an example of the actions and the direct results of the most recent election. I really think we're going to see more actions like the one in Albany and other districts. I just don't think it was expected to happen so quickly. While we don't know the actual reasons for Goff's termination, the termination vote passed as a direct result of the new board members that were sworn in. And one thing I noticed working on stories about Albany is just how polarized things seem to be there right now. It just feels like a mini version of what's happening around the country and in politics the last several years. It's all just now showing up at schools more than I've seen.
How much has the pandemic and everything connected with it played into the increase in interest in school boards?
One thing I've heard talking to school board members across the state is that the pandemic allowed for more access to school board meetings and school district decision making, which is great. I mean, meetings are being live streamed now, whereas before you may have had to go into the meeting in person, and not everyone has the flexibility to do that. At the same time, kids are at home, so parents are seeing more of the educational process their students are going through. Parents and families see more of what actually happens at school because the classroom was at home. Add to that the frustration among parents about the reopening process, some parents around the reopening process and all of the health and safety protocols, and all of the people who supported all the health and safety protocols and distance learning. And you have higher attendance at meetings and more of an interest in what's going on and what decisions are being made at these meetings.
So that's the pandemic piece of this. What about racial justice protests and all the conversations that followed after the murder of George Floyd? How does that play into this?
Yeah, after George Floyd's murder, school districts all over passed resolutions pledging to be anti-racist and creating plans to make schools more equitable and just a better experience for students of color, students and other marginalized groups. An example, what Melissa Goff just mentioned about the libraries, that's something I had reported on in a Southwest Washington school district as well. So the work was happening, these conversations were underway, and then you've got that interest from families, from community, from schools and school boards about how can we make the school environment more supportive while also having students see themselves reflected in what they're learning. But you also had some backlash to some of those decisions and conversations. And that's what I think we're seeing continue now and really just ramp up.
So there was an increase in interest and money in school board elections, particularly from both new and existing conservative political action groups. How successful were they statewide?
I think I'd say it was a mix. I mean, you have districts like Albany and Newburgh who elected some of the folks supporting some of those ideals and backed by more conservative groups. But then you have districts like Salem-Keizer and Bend, where voters rejected those candidates in favor of more, you might call them more conservative candidates, in favor of more liberal candidates. So I wouldn't say it was across the board one way or another.
Can you give us a sense for what is happening in Newburgh schools right now?
Yeah, definitely. So Newburgh is one of those districts that passed an anti-racist resolution after George Floyd was murdered. But now there's kind of a walking back of that and a trying to walk back and reverse state policies like Every Student Belongs, which OPB's Sam Stites reported on earlier this week. This is legislation, a policy backed by the Oregon Department of Education that prohibits hate symbols, requires districts to have processes in place to deal with bias incidents. And in Newburgh, it's become a point of contention for the school board and part of a larger discussion about reversing that policy, and other policies started at the district's board meeting last month. But the thing is, districts are required by the state to have Every Student Belongs in place, and their funding could be in jeopardy in the future if they don't. So that's definitely something to watch. Next week, the board will continue that conversation and possibly vote on those policies, Every Student Belongs and the anti-racist resolution, as well as banning Black Lives Matter and gay pride flags, as I think you mentioned at the top there.
What other districts stand out to you right now?
Well, I'm curious to see how these new board members do in their roles. I'm thinking about Ben Lapine and Salem-Keizer, as well as how boards listen to their communities and try to listen to their communities. Something that the Albany board members said they want to do more of are listening sessions. You mentioned the Bend one that I think highlighted some of the tension and conflict that we're going to see boards dealing with in these next few months, especially as we get closer to the start of school. I mean, we've got all this stuff going on just a month before the start of the school year. So I think it's really it's all very interesting right now to be an education reporter. I'll tell you that. Another district that I'm interested in is Tigard-Tualatin. They've got new board members, but the district has also been one of the leaders in the state when it comes to equity work and policies. It's also made them the target of some national conservative media.
Just briefly, I want to turn back to the national backlash against the reckoning with our racist past and how structural racism works today. With Oregon's state standards, could any school board just say, we don't want our students to learn about slavery or Jim Crow or Oregon's sundown laws? Could they do that?
Not exactly. There's the standards and there's the curriculum. And so the standards are what Oregon has control over. The state has control over and has districts adapt their curriculum to, if that makes sense. So while things like slavery and Jim Crow are part of Oregon's social science standards, or might be in the future, it will be up to districts to implement the curriculum that will cover those standards. And that's what happens at the district level. So curriculum is based on standards, but approved and solidified at the district level. And that's where we may see board involvement.
Elizabeth, thanks very much.
Thanks, Dave.
Liz Miller is OPB's K-12 education reporter.